And greetings to my 5 subscribers, 5683, who are interested in understanding the mindset of the communists and the origins of this mindset. We're in Russia and we're at the year 1905. Russia was, to a certain extent, the victim of Western financial imperialism. The factories were financed by European capitalists. Many of them were state-owned by the Czar. These factories were new, they were huge. Most of the workers in Russia worked in these huge, new factories. The railroads were poor, communications were poor, farm equipment was backward, education was almost non-existent. So Russia was, to a certain extent, the victim of Western financial imperialism, but she practiced an imperialism of her own, and this will give you some understanding of how this Russo-Japan war started. Russia practiced an imperialism of her own at the expense of the semi-civilized people of Central and Eastern Asia. Russia tried to expand into the Crimean Peninsula, but was stopped by the West. The Tsars tried to expand toward India and was stopped by the British that held India. Nicholas, unlike his father, seemed to have a great attraction to the idea of military conquest, and with his deeply religious Tsarina, he believed that his army was really bringing Christian civilization to the much despised Asiatic heathens. In these expansionist dreams, he was urged on by his elder cousin Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, who hoped to keep Russian power entangled in Asiatic adventures. But as Russian designs on Korea became more and more obvious, the Japanese grew alarmed. They had their own ambitions in this area, and they felt genuinely threatened by the Russian menace. As negotiations dragged on and on, the Japanese felt they could wait no longer. Suddenly, on February the 8th, 1904, without a declaration of war, Admiral Hijacking Togo's warships raided the great Russian naval base at Port Arthur, dealing the Tsar's Far Eastern fleet a mortal blow within a few hours. Japanese infantry was soon poured into Korea and Manchuria, and the Russo-Japanese War was on. On the Russian side, the war was marked by incredible inefficiency and outright scandal. The Russian commander at Port Arthur, which was considered an impregnable fortress, surrendered when he still had food and ammunition for 4 months. The single-track Trans-Siberian Railroad proved inadequate to transfer armies. Admiral Togo, whose place in the history of naval warfare is comparable to that of Nelson, soon smashed up the remains of the Russian Pacific Fleet and imposed a blockade on the Korea-Manchurian coast. To break this blockade, the Russian fleet was sent around the continent of Africa, across India, over to the coast of what is now China, and there they were demolished by the Japanese Navy. And a peace conference was held in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, September 1905, under the patronage of President Theodore Roosevelt. The Russians obtained very lenient terms, but they had lost Korea and Manchuria. But this loss of influence in Korea and Manchuria, the explosion of the Tsar's dream of conquest, were nothing compared to the undermining of the Tsarist authority back home. The Russian workers, whose daily life had been made even more intolerable by wartime speed-ups, food shortages, and prices, whose friends and brothers had perished in scandalously mismanaged battles, began a series of strikes in St. Petersburg and Moscow at the war's end. They were led in protest by a Russian Orthodox priest named Father Georgy Gapon. So ineffectual had the police considered Father Gapon's revolutionary leadership in the past that they actually supported him as a sort of safety valve for the workers' anger. In 1905, they miscalculated. In January of that year, the St. Petersburg metal workers went on strike for 4 days. When this showed no effect, Father Gapon wrote a letter to the Tsar saying, "Sir, do not believe the ministers. They are cheating you in regard to the real state of affairs. The people believe in you. They have made up their minds to gather at the Winter Palace tomorrow at 2 p.m. to lay their needs before you. Do not fear anything. Stand tomorrow before the people and accept our humblest petition. I, the representative of the working men, and my comrades, guarantee the inviolability of your person. Signed, Gapon. Nicholas's response to this letter was to leave St. Petersburg at once with his family for the palace at Tsarskoye-Selo. Behind him, as a reception committee, he left battalions of heavily armed police and the inevitable troops of mounted Cossacks. The Cossacks were fierce fighters and superb horsemen. They had been the last line of defense for the Czars of Russia for many centuries. They were fugitive serfs originally, who during the 16th century had organized into fighting bands in the region of the Ukraine, and the very word Cossack is probably derived from the Turkish word meaning adventurer. Anyway, these Cossacks were left behind to protect the palace when Nicholas fled to another palace at Tsarskoye-Selo. And Father Gapon had organized a bunch of workers to present a petition. These Cossacks had been left behind to guard the palace. On January 22nd, 2005, 200,000 workers and their families, 200,000 workers and their families, led by Father Gapon, made their way in dignified procession to the Winter Palace. They carried icons and pictures of the Czar and sang "God Save the Czar" as they trudged through the icy streets. In his hand, Father Gapon carried their petition. It requested an 8-hour day, a minimum wage of 1 ruble a day, no overtime, and the calling together of a constituent assembly to draft a constitution for Russia. He had intended to hand this petition to the Czar personally, while his followers waited patiently in the snow outside the palace. The officers of the palace called upon the crowds to disperse as soon as they came into view. 200,000 people cannot disband quickly. Besides, they were grimly determined to reach the Czar, who they thought might still grant their request. The police and Cossacks, in panic before this immense throng, suddenly opened fire, shooting into the dense masses of men, women, and children from a distance of about 15 yards. They kept firing until the snow was reddened with blood. 500 people were killed, untold thousands wounded among the screaming, helpless crowd on what became known as Bloody Sunday. Nicholas II did more than all the underground revolutionaries to give his people a lesson in what autocracy meant. Nationwide revolution was now inevitable. From Finland, where he was hiding from the police, Father Gapon wrote the Czar later on, saying, "The innocent blood of workers, their wives and children, lies forever between you, O soul destroyer, and the Russian people. Let all the blood that has been shed, hangman, fall upon you and your kindred." A veritable whirlwind of bloodshed and destruction was to follow Bloody Sunday, but it was not led by Father Gapon. For its leaders, the Russian Revolution of 1905 turned to a new generation of revolutionaries, hardened realists who had been brought up in the awful school of Tsarist terror and who were dedicated to the ideas of Karl Marx.